Hello everybody, I'm some Loudmouth on the internet with an opinion, and probably my favorite YouTube channel for the past 4 or 5 years has been a guy named Teal Deer.
Teal Deer, can you hear that distant sound rolling over the hills? That is the sound of land whales having their poor life's decisions validated by shaming normal and underweight people, no less.
True to his YouTube name, which is an abbreviation for Too Long Didn't Read, Teal Deer does extensive reading on various topics that are relevant to today's culture war, and he does an absolutely fantastic job of picking apart bad arguments and misinformation. Whether it's the pink tax, the wage gap, false rape allegations, or other nonsense feminist social engineering, no other YouTuber does a better job in debunking the utter lies and misinformation propagated by modern feminists and social justice warriors than Teal Deer. Last year, in one of my favorite videos Teal Deer did, he examined the subject of lonely men, aka incels, and the tendency of feminists to use them as their punching bag. He showed various studies on the harmful effects of loneliness, and showed why it's better to empathize with lonely men than to denigrate and shit on them, as feminists typically do. But Teal Deer's message that unattractive men are actually human beings is one that's very controversial among today's left. So it was inevitable someone on YouTube would take issue with it. Enter a YouTuber who bites. I'm sorry, I apologize. Enter the YouTuber named Bite, who decided to do a reply to Teal Deer's video on incels. And I'm doing a reply to his reply. This is fun. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome. Today, we're looking at incels, people who are involuntarily celibate and deal with this celibacy in an unhealthy, antisocial, and sometimes violent fashion.
And that's the first claim Bite makes in this video, that incels are predominantly antisocial and violent. Now, of course, many incels do exhibit these exact characteristics, and there have indeed been horrific acts of violence done in the name of inceldom. There probably have throughout the course of human history. But are incel men, involuntarily celibate men that is, more violent than the general population as a whole? Let's look into some evidence on the matter. According to statistics by the CDC, half of all female homicide victims were killed by an intimate partner. More than 55% of deaths were related to intimate partner violence, and the vast majority of those were carried out by a male partner. Not by an angry incel who was rejected, but by a man a woman was intimately involved with and knew. Violent acts done in the name of inceldom are actually remarkably rare given the huge population of sexless men in our country. And this says something I think really needs to be stated. Most of them are, at their core, good guys. A lot of them have issues. A lot of them are depressed. A lot of them have anxiety. A lot of them are really sad and don't feel like they have a direction in their lives. And sometimes they feel the need to vent this in very unhealthy ways, but at their core, they are not violent people. They are not psychopathic. At their core, they really are just sad and lonely.
Since this is such a complex and serious topic, we definitely want to get the best possible opinion. So, I think we should ask a Cyan Deer about it. That's right, we're talking about TLDR.
Teal Deer. Apparently these days, incels get the bullet too. At least that's the impression that one would get reading all of the mainstream media articles attacking them relentlessly that have come out over the past few weeks since a specific van attack in Toronto, Canada. Indeed, those articles have now apparently become the myriad of citations on the incel page of Wikipedia. So because a bunch of people have asserted a load of stuff on the internet, that apparently now makes this fact, which is why apparently self-identified incels are mostly white, male, and heterosexual, and discussions on incel forums are often characterized by resentment, misanthropy, self-pity, self-loathing, misogyny, racism, a sense of entitlement to sex, and an endorsement of violence against sexually active people. And then there's the mandatory link to the Southern Poverty Law Center, as if they're an organization that you should take seriously for some reason, as opposed to them being what they are, which is just a bunch of randomers on the internet writing stuff on a website. Basically a bunch of glorified bloggers. But apparently some people out there work under the delusion that they are some sort of authority on some things for some reasons.
Well, That's certainly an interesting take on the issue. I don't know where to begin. Well, about the SPLC. They're not a blog. They're just not. They're an organization founded by lawyers. They have lawyers working for them. They filed and won lawsuits against institutional racism, racial segregation, white supremacist groups, and more. They have an office building. They have multiple office buildings. You can't just equate that to a random, entitled millennial making stuff up on the internet.
And they're also an organization that has numerous times falsely slandered people as belonging to extremist hate groups when they don't. And in one particular instance, were forced to pay a settlement of over $3.3 million to someone they falsely labeled an anti-Muslim extremist.
So, Teal'c claims that the media coverage of incels is full of lies and vitriol. Now, I would love to tell you exactly how accurate this claim is, but I can't, because he doesn't cite any articles that supposedly have this problem beyond mentioning every single article cited by Wikipedia's incel page. And I'm not gonna read 126 articles just because Teal'c was too lazy to do his own work.
So he actually did provide citations, but you think he provided too many, and you don't want to read through all of them, and thus he's the one being lazy here. This is something he does several times throughout this video. He'll come up with incredibly lazy excuses to ignore all the vast counter-evidence to his narrative. If Teal'c had provided only a couple citations, Byte would have then complained, oh, those are just a couple isolated examples. But since he provided too many, Byte's like, oh, that's a lot, I can't read through all that. Either way, he can just dismiss the counter-evidence. As one example, last year I did a video response to an article The Guardian published on the subject of incels. I'll link the video below in the description, but to sum it up, the author of that article had a psychotic hatred for anyone who would show any kind of sympathy to incels. She clearly did not view them as human beings whatsoever, and articles like this are not that uncommon.
Instead, I have 3 random articles that I found through Google. They don't necessarily disprove Teal'c's claim, but at least they're, evidence that I'm going to show you that you can easily check. The first is from an outlet called Villainess, and in it, the author included multiple hyperlinks to support her claims. Unfortunately, if you try clicking on the hyperlinks, you'll find that the site can't be reached, but you can still see evidence of what was written there by looking at the site address, and you can see that she wasn't lying.
It is unfortunately true that some incels on some forums do indeed post violent comments or ones that are dripping with rather unjustified hatred. Many incels suffer from very severe mental illnesses, and they sometimes vent their frustrations in rather unhealthy ways. But I feel it's incredibly hypocritical for feminists to really judge these guys for that. I would really like to know how violent threats and violent comments on incel forums are in any way worse than the constant stream of violent, insane, and hateful comments that feminists post openly on major social media platforms every day. When an incel posts about wanting to hurt women, well, this is a very serious threat. We have to do something. Think of the women's. But when a feminist posts kill all men, just a prank, bro. Stop being such a snowflake. And a lot of those accounts were verified Twitter accounts, meaning that Twitter knows who these people are and intentionally protect their hate speech. In Tim Pool's epic confrontation with a Twitter executive, Tim Pool confronted one Twitter executive on Twitter's policy of banning people for misgendering transgender individuals. This was justified by the fact that transgender individuals have a much higher suicide rate than the general population as a whole, and thus, by Twitter's logic, deserve special protection. Well, men commit suicide at nearly 4 times the rate women do, and involuntarily celibate men, or men suffering from depression or social isolation, have much higher suicide rates even than that. And yet, to my knowledge, Twitter has never banned anyone for hate speech against incels, and very rarely ever enforces hate speech rules against men. So hate speech is protected on Twitter as long as it's hate directed at a group the left have decided is okay to hate.
So the first question is, what is an incel? Well, it is just someone who is involuntarily celibate. That is someone who desires a romantic relationship and yet is not in one.
Never mind. This whole discussion is screwed from the beginning because Teal'c doesn't know what an incel is. I don't know what's worse, the fact that he doesn't realize the word isn't strictly literal, the bare minimum amount of understanding everyone will have after 5 seconds of researching incels, or the fact that he thinks a literal reading of the term involuntary celibate is someone who can't get a romantic relationship despite wanting one. This condescending bastard doesn't know what words mean.
He doesn't know what words mean for assuming involuntarily celibate means involuntarily celibate. It sounds like you're the one who doesn't know what words mean.
Pretty much every person will be an involuntary celibate at some point in their lives. Most people will find themselves at some point having a day, a week, a month, a year, however long, where they want to have a romantic relationship and yet are not in one. This is actually a completely normal part of life. However, a lot of the people that you find frequenting incel forums and whatnot online, these are people for whom this process has gone on for a very extended period of time, often a number of years, in some cases decades, perhaps even the entirety of their lives. And this is why I can't understand the vitriol aimed at these people.
See, this is why understanding what you're talking about is so important. It makes sense to be outraged at anyone who would be so cruel as to demonize someone for simply talking about their loneliness online. But that's not what's happening. The criticisms aimed at incels are of those incels who are specifically misogynistic, violent, and self-destructive. The problem isn't their inceldom, it's the destructive mindset of their community.
But that isn't true and you know it. If that were the case, feminists would only ever use incel as a pejorative when addressing actual stated incels or talking to a particular community. If you have interacted with feminists over the past year in any capacity, you would absolutely know that's not the case. Feminists use the word incel as a random ad hominem insult in political discussions so often it's become comical. Often in ways that don't make any goddamn sense. Feminists hate it when you tie a woman's worth to her sexual value, but they will do the exact same thing to men on a regular basis, constantly. Their lack of self-awareness at their hypocrisy is actually astonishing.
These articles and Twitter folk and whatnot basically just declaring, well, it's all your fault. Everything that is wrong with you. You are just such a fundamentally unlikable, untouchable human. And all you need to do to fix this is to wash the Cheeto dust out of your beard, have a shower, get some decent clothes, hit the gym, and learn you some confidence. And then all of your problems will be solved, as if that is just as easy as it is.
Oh, well, if people are saying that to incels, I would agree that it's a bit much. But since I've never seen anyone talk even remotely like this anywhere, and TLDR hasn't cited any sources for these claims, or shown any screenshots of people saying these things, I can't say anything about these ideas, including whether or not they even exist.
Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying? Oh my god, stop fucking lying.
Yeah, would have been a real good thing if TLDR had only provided screen caps of people on Twitter or social media saying such things. Oh wait, he did!
I am already tired of hearing the word incel. You are not involuntarily celibate, you are unfuckable in your current form. It's your job to make the changes necessary to get someone to want to fuck you, not their job to fuck your creep ass simply because you want it. Okay, can we please stop using incel and use the scientific term? Pathetic fucking losers who live in their parents' basement and masturbate to misplaced and unjustified rage for manufacturing some world where they're a victim and not a piece of trash.
That clip was from the exact same video that you are replying to. So we're left with only two possible options. Either you decided to do a reply video to someone without watching the entire video, in which case you are amazingly stupid to do such a thing, or you are deliberately lying to your audience. Which is it?
Anyway, after this, he explains some very in-depth research he did on social isolation. It's impressive stuff, honestly. I think he has something like 10 sources for this claim. As impressive as it is, I'm not going to show you his research because it's, completely irrelevant. See, the research he shows us looks at the effects of social isolation in children and babies. Children and babies don't have sex, TLDR, you creepy
TLDR did not at any point ever say children or babies have sex. Nor did he even remotely imply such a thing. That is such a slimy, dishonest misinterpretation of what TLDR said and what he's trying to say. It's borderline slanderous. But yes, psychological studies on babies are very relevant on the topic of incels and social isolation. Behavioral studies on babies are incredibly useful for examining the development of the human psyche and human behaviors by basically giving us a window into the whole nature versus nurture debate. Babies are the closest thing we have to a human blank slate. Humans that haven't really been contaminated yet through socialization, through modern culture, pop culture, and other social interactions. They're basically humans at their most primitive form. And through studies on babies, we can often trace the developments of behaviors that will affect people later in life. You may have forgotten this fact, Byte, but literally every single adult in the world is a former child. And issues and trauma that affected somebody as a child can often still affect people much later in life. There's no magical manna that hits us the moment we turn 18 that removes us of all childhood trauma. Childhood trauma can still affect adults. Many incels were victims of bullying and child abuse early in their lives and still suffer from that trauma. And very, very sadly, in the case of some children, the science is also incredibly clear on the incredibly damaging and harmful effects that happen under extreme neglect. Data showing the effects on babies that come from extreme neglect and how babies require and crave social contact from such a very early age really help paint a picture of just how important socialization is to us as a species. It shows that our evolution as social primates really necessitated contact from other humans at a very fundamental biochemical level. This is not something that is taught to babies as they grow up. This is something that is inherent deep in their biochemistry. But yeah, we should ignore all this data and all the conclusions you can reach from it because babies don't have sex.
Other than that, he has sources he cites, but doesn't discuss that look at the effects of social isolation in older adults, middle-aged adults, and no age group in particular. But he has no research on the effects of social isolation in teenagers and young adults specifically. He has sources on every single age group except the ones he's talking about.
First of all, that isn't true. The study on Does Rejection Hurt that TLDR cites does indeed deal with young people. But what do you mean the age group he's talking about? TLDR was talking about the human race as a whole. That's why he cited data from a variety of different age groups to show that isolation is extremely harmful for humans at every stage of our development. From age 1 to 99, it doesn't matter. Humans need contact with other humans at all stages of life. He wasn't talking about any particular age group. He never said that. Where'd you get this?
His research is also about general social isolation. Social isolation, as in no friends, no family, no romantic relationships, but maybe other kinds of relationship. These 10 sources don't even so much as mention romantic or sexual relationships once.
That is yet another complete and total lie. TLDR's study that he cited on Does Rejection Hurt says this. This study suggests that social pain is analogous in its neurocognitive function to physical pain, alerting us when we have a sustained injury to our social connections, allowing restorative measures to be taken. Understanding the underlying commonalities between physical and social pain unearths new perspective on issues such as why physical and social pain are affected similarly by both social support and neurochemical interventions, and why it hurts to lose someone we love. Keep in mind that this study was Does Rejection Hurt, not Does Loss Hurt. So they are not talking about a loved one who died. They are talking about a loved one who rejected them and left them. This study indeed does mention romantic love. Your claim that it doesn't was false.
Even if I pretend his research isn't completely bunk, it's still irrelevant because none of this was in dispute in the first place. No one seriously believes that a lack of intimacy is some trivial thing with no adverse effects that shouldn't garner any sympathy. The only people who think that incels aren't legitimately suffering are in TLDR's head.
Oh man, Bite, you should be a comedian saying ridiculous shit like that. The idea that a feminist would have empathy for a heterosexual man who is struggling in his life. Give me a fucking break, Bite. A struggling man, or any man who is dealing with any kind of problems, is as equally likely to get empathy from a tiger shark as they are from a feminist.
Well, actually, I only say incel because dangerously entitled, clinically unfuckable misogynist takes too long to say.
And if you think comments like those are rare or isolated examples TLDR found after a lot of searching, I assure you they aren't. Go on Twitter, go type in the word incel into the search bar there, and you will see dozens of hate comments just like those written every single day.
So with all of this out of the way, being someone who greatly desires some sort of social contact but can't have it, well, it's a terrible situation to be in. It's not healthy from a physical or a mental standpoint, and it will probably leave you feeling as if you're trapped in a cycle of never-ending despair, misery, and loneliness. But how on earth would someone end up like this anyway? Well, if the actions of what women are doing are anything to go by, you may remember the OkCupid data which suggested that women find a staggering 80% of men to be less than average in attractiveness. Tinder fares very much the same way, where 78% of women are all fighting over the top 20% of men, leaving the bottom 80% of men to be fighting over the bottom 22% of women. The absolute runaway, unregulated nature of the sexual marketplace seems to be potentially part of the explanation.
I have several problems with TLDR's data. For one, he doesn't fucking link to it. He gave us 10 useless sources to make sure we definitely agree with him about loneliness being bad, but he can't give us one citation for this?
A bit of an oversight on TLDR's part that he didn't link the OkCupid data to this video. He has linked that data in several other videos he's done, so he has cited it, just not that easy for you to find it. Because, as I've shown before, Bite, you're very, very lazy. But give me a break, Bite. You could have easily Google searched this stuff, and you would know that TLDR was not lying. He was not making up this data. And I will link as much of it as I can.
I can't help but think there is a reason why so many societies all around the world talk about things like monogamy, talk about and generally enforce institutions such as marriage. Why it's just something so very common that societies come up with structures that encourage people to pair off one-to-one.
He thinks marriage was made to combat hypergamy? Well, clearly it doesn't work because we have marriage, but we still apparently have hypergamy. Marriage is not a magic binding spell you can use to catch women. Married women can still date other people, but he thinks they did use it. But then, what, it suddenly stops working?
Holy straw man, Batman. Of course marriage is not a magical binding spell that prevents women from dating other people. Millions of men throughout history have unwittingly raised the offspring of a better-looking man. This happens all the time, even today in the age of paternal testing. But societal pressures against adultery do make it less likely to happen, just as widespread societal pressures against any behavior do make that behavior less likely to occur. That is the entire point for societal pressures against certain behaviors. Not to mention that throughout history, and in some countries even to this day, women are legally forbidden to commit adultery and have severe penalties on doing so. Things like that do make adultery less likely to happen.
And he's saying all this because of online dating data? Jesus Christ, TLDR, marriage has been around for thousands of years. You can't use online data as evidence of what the world was like 1,000 years ago.
Yes, we can. Because we are the same species as we were 1,000 years ago. We are the same species as we were 100,000 years ago. And we are the same genus that we were 1,000,000 years ago. Evolution is a very slow process, and a lot of aspects of our primate evolution are still present in us today. And besides, genetic data totally correlates with today's online data. According to this article published in the science section of the New York Times, a genetic study examining ancestral DNA both from mitochondrial DNA and from variability in the Y chromosomes, the amount of variation observed among any set of chromosomes surveyed in a population is proportional to two factors, the rate of mutation and the size of the population. If we factor out differences in the rate of mutation, then we're left over difference in the amount of variation between two samples of chromosomes should be due to differences in the sizes of the populations from which they were sampled. Applying this method, we were able to estimate the relative size of female and male human populations. We found that the breeding sex ratio is about 2 females per male. So for thousands upon thousands of generations, possibly well before our species even evolved, it has always been the norm for far more females than males to pass their genes on to the next generation. How is this possible unless most females were breeding with only a very small number of males? Hypergamy. It has been the historical norm.
Also, hypergamy doesn't even exist, as evidenced by this diagram representing sexual relationships among students at an American high school.
Wait, you're actually going to try to present evidence against hypergamy? I actually am very impressed with you on that, Bite. I know I've been harsh to you throughout most of this video, most of it very well deserved, but the fact that you're actually going to try to present evidence to back up your assertions on the non-existence of hypergamy is something I actually admire that you're going to attempt. Reading mainstream media articles on the subject of incels, it's amazing how almost none of them ever even try to address hypergamy and try to debunk hypergamy. They mostly just repeat ad hominem attack after ad hominem attack against incels. So go for it, Bite. Show me your evidence. I'll bite. Or you'll bite, or, well, one of us is going to bite here and it ain't going to be me.
We can see there are both men and women with 1 sexual partner, 2 sexual partners, 3 sexual partners, and even 4 or 5 or more sexual partners. There are women having sex with multiple men who haven't had any other sexual partners, men having sex with multiple women who haven't had any other sexual partners, and women and men with multiple sexual partners having sex with each other. All of this in similar numbers.
The main reason I decided to do a response to this video was so I could debunk this study, as the misinformation here really needs a rebuttal. No, this study absolutely does not refute the science of hypergamy. There are several reasons why, but the first one isn't really a problem with the study itself, but something really dumb Bite says about the study.
And while there is one male outlier with 9 different sexual partners, his sexual interactions only make up a tiny fraction of the graph, and half of his sexual partners aren't even exclusive to him. There are simply no Chads to be found.
Sorry, Bite, I must have misheard that. I must have had, a little piece of stupid caught in my ear or something. What did you just say?
And while there is one male outlier with 9 different sexual partners, there are simply no Chads to be found.
Now, admittingly, the term Chad is not a scientific or legal term. It's basically just a bit of internet slang. It just means you're a handsome dude who has a relatively easy time getting laid. Yeah, a kid who has 9 sexual partners, sleeps with 9 girls before he's graduated high school, absolutely qualifies. You genuinely don't seem to understand the 80-20 rule. When they say that 80% of women sleep with 20% of men, they don't literally mean that every man from that top 20% sleeps with all 80% of women in the world, or 80% of women in his school. It just means he has a highly disproportionate number of sexual encounters versus a more slightly above average man who will have only a few, or an incel who will have none. Yeah, 9 sexual partners, 9 girls. He's a Chad. That is assuming he's telling the truth about that many partners, and I'll get to that in a minute.
Granted, this data does have some limitations, mainly that this graph was made based on a survey done in the mid-90s, and that it doesn't include data on those students with no sexual partners.
Which are both very serious limitations. This high school from the mid-90s was a basic middle American high school that was predominantly white. And it was right after the AIDS epidemic in a very conservative area. This is not a sample size that represents the entire Western world. Not even close. Particularly since this is well before online dating became a thing. But even those reasons are not the main reason to discount this study.
But despite these limitations, it's clear that the data doesn't reflect a world where it's in the nature of women to be hypergamous, or where the 80-20 rule holds true.
The main reason to discount this study is because all of this is self-reported data. Self-reported data is notoriously unreliable. It's literally the least reliable form of evidence there is. There is a very good reason why the majority of psychological experiments don't tell their test subjects about the true nature of the experiment. Because if they did, it would contaminate the results and render the results rehearsed and artificial. In this example from the Milgram experiments, just imagine if these test subjects were told, yeah, we're totally punking you, those shocks, they're totally fake. The experiment would have no value. Simply asking people how many people they've slept with will never give you accurate results. Because you may not realize this, people tend to lie. People lie all the time. And there is significant evidence that people lie about their number of sexual partners. One study decided to try to test this with a fake lie detector. In this study, they also gave people a survey asking them the number of sexual partners they had. And then they also gave people a survey asking them the number of sexual partners they had, but this time with a fake lie detector test that the subjects believed would measure the accuracy of their readings. And they found that both sexes would lie about their number of partners, but in opposite ways. Men in general would over-report their number of sexual partners, whereas on the fake lie detector test reported fewer number. Women, on the other hand, under-reported their number of sexual partners, and to an even greater extent, it was found that under the fake lie detector test reported nearly twice as many sexual partners as they did without. It is very likely, in fact it is most likely, that a great number of students in this survey gave false information. Very likely that the boys in this study over-exaggerated their number of sexual partners, and the girls in this study under-exaggerated their number of sexual partners. That kid who claimed he had 9 sexual partners, maybe he had that many and he was the giga Chad he claimed to be, or maybe he had only half that many, or maybe he had none and he was lying his virgin ass off. Who the hell knows? None of this data is verified. This was literally the best piece of evidence I have ever read against hypergamy. And it's still really, really bad evidence. The study uses a very small sample size. The data in it is completely unverified. It's very localized. This study does not disprove hypergamy. This is bad science right here.
Your theories are the worst kind of popular tripe. Your methods are sloppy, and your conclusions are highly questionable. You are a poor scientist, Dr. Finkman.
Now, if we're going to prove or disprove hypergamy, first we need a really good definition for hypergamy. So, what is hypergamy? Hypergamy in general basically means trading up in a relationship. It refers to the reproductive strategy in females of wanting a male with higher status than themselves, either better looking than themselves, richer than themselves, or having some position of power that they themselves do not have. Whereas men, by contrast, will be far more concerned with having a greater number of partners and will be far less discerning about the quality of those partners.
I never fucked a 10, but one night I fucked 5 twos.
Now, of course, hypergamy only refers to a statistical trend, and there are exceptions to every single rule. Maybe not every single woman is a picky prude who demands a Marvel Chris, and not every man is a poonhound who will stick his dick in any hole he sees, but things will tend more towards that direction than not. But then the question remains, why would women be naturally far choosier in their mate selection than men are? From a biological resources standpoint, a woman expends far, far more biological resources and energy into gestating a baby than a man does producing sperm. Not to mention that it's possible for one man to impregnate hundreds of women, so men have the ability to spread their genes throughout the population in a way that's impossible for a woman to do. A reproductive strategy that favors quantity over quality can be very successful for a man if you manage to impregnate enough women. Even if some of your children don't survive, as long as you have many progeny, it really won't matter and your genes will still survive into the next generation. Women who have to spend far more biological resources into their offspring than men do need to be far pickier in whose DNA they take. Although from an individual biological perspective, this makes perfect sense and is very rational behavior from an evolutionary standpoint, it unfortunately does have huge societal costs. With women only being willing to accept the DNA from a relatively small number of men, it will inevitably lead to a situation where a very large percentage of the male population are disaffected, depressed because they are unable to find a mate. Which is why we have so many of the subject of Teal Deer's video. The unloved, the unwanted, the underprivileged, and the marginalized. The incels.
Look at all the lonely people.
If a space alien were to study the mating patterns of many different animal species prior to studying humans, he wouldn't find any of this at all surprising. It is a common trend and the great norm throughout the animal kingdom for males to be the competitors and females the selectors when it comes to mating. Males will ruthlessly compete with each other, sometimes in terms of actual physical battles, and other times simply in terms of putting up competitive displays. And in both cases, only a very small number of males ever win these competitions, with most males end up being incels.
It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
Of course, through the vastly diverse animal kingdom, the level of hypergamous mating patterns is not consistent from species to species, but is usually correlated with the level of sexual dimorphism within a species. Sexual dimorphism, of course, is the physical and anatomical differences within the males and females of the same species. Let's take two birds as an example of this principle, the peafowl and the emperor penguin. Now, of course, the peafowl is an example of a bird with a great degree of sexual dimorphism, with males having luxurious tail feathers that females do not have, thus making them incredibly easy to spot. Male and female emperor penguins, by contrast, look mostly the same. It would take an expert to be able to tell the difference. And it should come as no surprise that peafowl are incredibly hypergamous, with a very small number of males fathering the next generation, whereas emperor penguins are very monogamous, meaning that both parents put an equal investment into raising the chick. But mating patterns more similar to the peacock are far more common in the animal kingdom than mating patterns similar to the emperor penguin. The emperor penguin, due to the very unique and harsh conditions of its environment, really requires both parents to invest in the chick. Otherwise, the chick wouldn't survive. So a mating strategy where a small number of males monopolize the females isn't really viable for emperor penguins. But for most of the animal kingdom, that's generally how it is. Possibly the most sexually dimorphic mammal on the planet is the elephant seal. Males are a whopping 4 times the size of the females, and are one of the largest animals on the planet, weighing over 4 tons. It should come as no surprise that elephant seals are also extremely hypergamous. Only 4% of male elephant seals ever get to father a single calf. So if you ever wonder why they look so angry all the time, that's why. In order to get the honor of being able to father a calf, elephant seals have to ruthlessly fight with each other. And humans are no exception to this rule. While we may not be as sexually dimorphic as the elephant seal, humans certainly have a great degree of sexual dimorphism. Men have much denser muscles than women, on average are larger, have more pronounced jaws, more body hair, and a huge number of anatomical differences. It's very easy for anyone to tell a man and a woman apart in general. Humans are a very sexually dimorphic species. But the response might be, yeah, just because every other sexually dimorphic animal throughout the animal kingdom practices hypergamy doesn't necessarily mean humans do. I mean, humans are different than other animals in lots of ways. Other animals, for example, don't make YouTube videos. Maybe a lack of hypergamy is just another way we're unique from the rest of the animal kingdom. Is there any specific evidence for hypergamous mating in humans? Yeah, OkCupid released data from over 70,000 active users, and did so controversially without the user's permission, meaning that this is not self-reported data given to somebody as part of a study, but simply data given unwittingly by several users in order to help them find a better partner. Thus, a far more accurate representation of human behavior. OkCupid data also seems to show that a first message sent by a woman is more than twice as likely to be answered and turned into a conversation than a first message sent by a man. And while sadly OkCupid has removed this from their blog, probably due to pressure from feminists, their data also clearly shows that women will rate a whopping 80% of men as below average looking, while men only rate 40% of women as below average looking. Simply put, women are very unattracted to the vast majority of men, whereas men are attracted to the majority of women. Another Tinder study using profiling the data from 3,600 active users found that men super liked 61% of female profiles created for this experiment, while women only liked less than 5% of male profiles conducted for this experiment. In another Tinder study, 59% of women estimate that they will like 10% or fewer of all profiles they encounter. In contrast, only 9% of men reported such high selectivity. In line with our earlier empirical findings, women report far higher probabilities of matching, with 63% of women estimating that over half of the profiles they like result in a match. With such high matching rates, it is unsurprising that women use a strategy whereby they only like profiles they are confidently attracted to. In contrast, 59% of male respondents estimate that 10% or under of their likes result in a match.
Teal'c talked about this in his video, that numerous lines of evidence from numerous online dating services shows that women have a tremendous advantage. Women have a tremendously easier time on average attracting men than men have for attracting women. I have heard many alternative explanations for this, and none of them really stand up to scrutiny. One alternative explanation is that women have an advantage on these services because there are more men than women on these services. And that may well be true, but then you'd have to answer, why is that? Likely because men were rejected in more traditional venues and then tried online as an alternative, which is something women have been far less likely to face. Simply put, there really is no reasonable explanation for this data other than hypergamy. Online data is not the only bit of evidence. The existence of sex workers also gives us a really good measure point for being able to test hypergamy. In a world without hypergamy, you would expect women to visit male sex workers at a pretty similar rate as men visit female sex workers. Is that what we find? No.
In reality, less than 1 in 5 total sex workers are men. And this is certainly not because fewer men want to become sex workers and earn a living by fucking.
Just basic laws of economics. The law of supply and demand. And the supply of dicks far exceeds the demand.
But the numbers are actually even worse on the scale of hypergamy when you look at who they're selling sex to. By and large, men on these websites seem to cater to other men, with about 57% of websites exclusively catering to other guys, with only 11% of sites focused on men selling to women.
That is actually incredibly remarkable, since heterosexual women outnumber gay and bisexual men combined well over 20 to 1. And yet, despite that, the number of gay and bisexual men exceeds the number of women who utilize the services of a male prostitute. So the question is, why is this the case?
As shown before, women have a remarkably easier time getting male attention than the reverse. So they're very easily able to get attention from men far more attractive than themselves if they simply take the initiative and make the first move.
And that is the reason why women rarely go to male prostitutes. Why pay for what you can easily get for free?
Men, by contrast, are almost certain to be rejected by any woman more attractive than they are, unless they can demonstrate higher value in some other way, such as a lot more money in the bank, some type of fame, or some type of position of power. If an unattractive man is highly unlikely to enter into any kind of money or position of power, his only real option if he wants to sleep with a woman more attractive than he is to hire a prostitute. Women are also overall far more likely than men to support laws that legally prohibit prostitution.
Gee, I wonder why that is. One genetic study examining our history from 8,000 years ago determined that at one point, 17 women reproduced for every man who did, due to a certain small number of men who accumulated most wealth in society, attracting most of the women. So yes, if the internet was a thing 8,000 years ago, incel forums would have been around back then just as they are today. This is nothing new.
Hypergamy is very real. It's supported by overwhelming evidence, both from social studies, from historical data, and from evolutionary biology. Simply put, denying hypergamy is tantamount and the same as denying the theory of evolution itself. And honestly, the kind of science denial that Byte engages in here, and that's shockingly common among internet feminists, is really frustrating for me to even have to debunk, because it's denying what everyone knows and everyone learns as a part of growing up. All of us learn from like 12 or 13 onward, pretty much since when we hit puberty, that girls have a much easier time getting attention from boys than boys have from getting from girls, and that girls are only attracted to a very small number of boys. This is just a part of life. This is something that everyone has already learned. So someone denying it like this is really frustrating.
This is like responding to a YouTuber who says that dogs don't bark, and me having to present a bunch of studies on the vocal cords of dogs to show that they do.
Dogs do bark. The sky is blue, water is wet, and women are naturally hypergamous. Duh.
So what has the knock-on effect of all of this been to the women who are still in the dating game while a disproportionate number of men are now out of the dating game? Well, what a surprise that over the past few years we have seen increasing numbers of articles along the lines of these ones. Women in their 30s and 40s basically screaming to the high heavens, where have all the good men gone? Because they spent their teenage years and their 20s and possibly a good chunk of their 30s relentlessly only chasing the best of the best men, turning down any and all men that they just didn't think were good enough for them. And now that their youth and fertility is spent and no one really wants them anymore, they expect men to man up and pick up all of their mistakes, rather than doing what their ancestors would have done and simply looking for Mr. Good Enough, Mr. Is stable, has a job, is reliable, and I can live with him. Instead, they've been told that they can have it all. The big, massive, high-flying career, the husband who's a male model and a millionaire, and all while effortlessly juggling multiple children. Well, sorry to break the illusion, but that doesn't happen. And articles such as these are the proof that women are not happy with the situation that they have put themselves in. But of course, this is all the fault of men. They just need to man up and go and get those university degrees so that they can be good enough for those women.
Okay, let's draw up a table, and on one side we'll have whatever the fuck that was, and on the other side we'll have a look at what the articles actually say. So, we have TLD complaining that women would be able to find partners if they weren't so goddamn choosy. But if we actually read the articles, we'll find they say things like, quote, I'd reluctantly split from the man I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with, unquote, and, quote, in my experience, a lot of men find an education a turn-off, it intimidates them, and they make assumptions, unquote. Or that there is, quote, a dating pool that has 4 women for every 3 men, so it gives way too much leverage to those college-educated men. And I think it encourages them to be too choosy and to delay settling down. You heard it here first, folks. If men are too choosy, then that means women are too choosy. How about that?
But those men in a very privileged position only get to be so choosy because women have denied the vast majority of men who don't meet their shallow standards. Thus, the very few men that do are some of the lucky, very small number who do get to be choosy. So really, it's women's choosiness that allow these small number of men to be choosy.
Finally, Tildia says that women expect men to get university degrees so they can be good enough. But if we actually read the articles, we'll find they say, quote, I don't care whether he studied, or even whether he went to university, as long as he can keep up, unquote.
Read between the lines. What the hell do you think she means when she says, if he can keep up? Do you literally think she's putting them on a racetrack and that she's running to get away from them and hoping that the guys will catch them?
If so, that would make this article extremely dark and disturbing. But that's not what she means. She means by if they can keep up, if they can meet her incredibly narrow and incredibly self-centered and incredibly petty standards she places on these guys. Very likely, the women in this article, when they were younger, were hot enough that they could get the kind of men they want. But now that they're older, the kinds of men that they're attracted to, the very small number of ultra-successful and ultra-good-looking men, don't really want them anymore because they can chase women who are much younger than them. So rather than simply grow up and lower their standards to men who would gladly accept them, men who would be fantastic providers, men who would love them very much, they instead whine that they can't get the millionaires and male models that they still so desperately want and will only accept. And yet the same mainstream media that relentlessly vilifies any man who dares express any feelings of loneliness online will give the incredibly privileged whining of these women a sympathetic ear. It's complete hypocritical bullshit.
Now, the rest of Byte's video I'm not going to bother responding to. In it, he takes a look at another TLDR video examining what's known as Project Consent. In it, TLDR tries to explain the subtleties of human interaction and human consent, and Byte just shouts, "Sexual assault is bad, dirt to derp."
Okay, Byte, so you think sexual assault is bad.
Oh, good for you!
Here's your trophy. Byte, your video is bad. You strawman dishonestly misrepresented TLDR several times, you came up with lazy justifications for ignoring the vast counter-evidence to your narrative, and the only actual evidence you present was a small isolated study with unverified self-reported data that is easy to dismiss on those grounds. This video will convince nobody. This is simply you preaching to the choir and preaching to people who already agree with you. I'm going to leave everyone with TLDR's excellent summation on the subject of social isolation from his original video.
And to all the people relentlessly attacking incels of late, I would ask them, try to imagine that. After all we've looked at regarding the physiological effects of isolation, the psychological effects of isolation, try to put yourselves in that position. Try to put yourself in the position of having never even been touched, despite your best efforts, possibly having been rejected hundreds if not thousands of times in your life. And this is something which I think a lot of people simply cannot relate to. And I find that it's something that especially women have a really hard time trying to understand, given how much society falls over itself to hand women anything that they want or need on a silver platter. And that, as we've seen from Tinder and OkCupid data, women have a remarkably easier time than men when it comes to the sexual marketplace. When you have so much inherent value that you are the one being approached and propositioned, it becomes even more difficult to imagine a scenario where you could propose to hundreds of people and always be told no.
You're a gentleman and a scholar, TLDR. I'm some loudmouth on the internet, and you just heard my opinion.
Special thanks to the Dark Conservatarian, Connor Johnson, and my other awesome patrons. And be sure to subscribe for more Loudmouth reviews, commentaries, and editorials.